Dog company doesn't have any mortars, said Dick Holmes when SSG Donnelly mentioned my name. Donnelly gave him that classic soldier shrug, the one that says, yeah, I know it doesn't make sense, but deal with it. Dick Holmes, a Ranger-tabbed staff sergeant, had this habit of referring to himself in the third person, Dick Holmes, always in the spotlight. Back in the day, he'd call the soldiers young warriors, when addressing them, a reminder of the gritty, old-school way of training. He was the type to take the job seriously but not himself. And I'll admit it, there was something I admired about him. Dick Holmes was, well, a character. One of those soldiers you didn't forget. SSG Donnelly gave me his quick stamp of approval, vouching for my ability to carry gear and follow orders before heading off. Without missing a beat, Dick Holmes passed me off to Corporal Kazinya like I was a hot potato. Kazinya filled me in, we've got a week in the field, so we're releasing the Joes early for the day. He told me when to come back, then dismissed me. As soon as I was dropped off, I walked by SSG Donnelly's squad and tossed a nonchalant, I'm heading home. SSG Donnelly hollered back, look at that, shamming already. Told you it'd be fine. Being part of the battalion mortars wasn't as active as being in a line company. The 120mm mortar system, with its 110-pound frame, is a battalion-level asset, massive but not something you'd be carrying on foot. You don't move it by hand, you're riding in transport vehicles, or it stays at the Forward Operating Base, FOB, with the battalion headquarters element. The 60mm mortars in the maneuver companies, though, were the ones you'd see moving a lot more. But not us. When you're on a 120mm crew, you're lifting and setting, not walking. And you'll bulk up. You'll gain weight, not all of it bad. I added 30 pounds in my time in the army, and while some of it was muscle, the rest, well, it was part of the life. We had a mix in our platoon. A few made it through Ranger School and a Special Forces selection, but there were also some guys rocking the dad bod look. It was a wide spectrum, if I'm being blunt. The battalion mortars weren't just more stationary, they were often out in the field, too. Fire missions were the name of the game. It didn't matter if it was officers, forward observers, or whoever, calls for fire were constant. We were up at all hours, supporting rifle companies with fire missions while they were running live training. It made for good practice and kept things interesting. Fire mission. That was the call, and we'd all drop whatever we were doing to send rounds downrange. We spent days, sometimes weeks, living in tents, doing fire missions. And when the rifle companies were done, we'd hop in for a piece of whatever training they were doing, compressed, but still good practice. The first day I showed up for PT at HHC, we were milling around by the arms room waiting for formation. I found myself on the edge of a group of unfamiliar faces. Hey new guy, you ever seen anything like this before? A Joe turned and flashed me. He pointed to some oddity on his junk and demanded my expert medical opinion. Before I could react, someone shouted from the back, go get rodded off the range. Where? Rodded off the range, it's a term with two meanings. 1. When you're leaving a firing range, you present your weapon with the bolt locked open and get a rod stuck down the barrel to ensure no live rounds are left. The other? Well, it's Army slang for when a medic uses a Q-tip to check for STDs, welcome to the mortar platoon, and a memorable introduction to specialist wear. HHC had the scout platoon, battalion aid, mortars, and a few other assets. There was always this friendly rivalry between the scouts and mortars. SSG Hager from the scouts loved to fan the flames, good-natured, but he knew how to get a rise out of us. Captain Hanlon, Hotel 6, was one of those quiet professionals, came from the 75th Ranger Regiment, and he had the kind of resume that made you do a double take, but you'd never know it from his demeanor. Our first sergeant was a walking legend, with a chest full of schools, badges, and tabs. Guy had all the tools you could ever need. Training with the mortars? It was grueling. I arrived as the summer heat really kicked in, and it felt like I lived in the field after that. But in between fire missions, I started diving into books, leaning up against stacks of mortar crates. Current events bored me, so I gravitated towards fiction. Slaughterhouse-5, Catch-22, Chuck Palahniuk. Hell, I even shifted from World War II history to Revolutionary War. In the days of flip phones and no electricity, downtime options were limited. Books, cards, cigarettes, and retelling the same damn stories about past field problems. We called it smoking and joking. Out on the mortar range, away from the battalion's main base, things were different. It was like Lord of the Flies with fewer rules. We were the red-headed stepchildren of the battalion. LT Camp was our anchor, big guy, football coach type, and the one who kept the chaos from swallowing us whole. The 11B infantry guys had their jokes, calling us POGs for our cushy setup out there, but, honestly, I preferred the mortars to training with dog company. At least here, I felt like I fit in. Firing a mortar is repetitive once you've done it once. Setting up the 120mm system was about as thrilling as bounding across cement. Every time was a lesson in frustration. It was the summer of bruised shins from tripods. But I'll never forget my first field problem with the 60mm. Dick Holmes showed me how to hand-fire the weapon. It was more relaxed than any of the other training I'd done so far. I could actually see where the rounds were landing, which gave it a certain cool factor. Holmes knelt next to me, adjusting my aim as we aimed for rusted-out armored vehicles in the impact zone. It felt like light infantry work, something I could get behind. One night, we lit up the sky with illumination rounds. It was like creating constellations in the night. Even as a grizzled cynic, I had to admit, it was a damn cool sight. The sky out there was unlike anything I'd ever seen. With no light pollution, the stars were sharper, clearer. You can't really appreciate how much you miss until you see the contrast. We shot a hell of a lot of rounds that summer. And we got good at it, fast. After a brief adjustment period, I found my rhythm in the mortar crew, and for the first time, it felt like I was part of something that mattered. In the Army, the term mortars isn't just about the weapons, it also refers to the soldiers who wield them. The crew I worked with was full of characters, each one more colorful than the last. Take Esau, for example. He enlisted from Micronesia, which, when I first met him, I learned was part of Guam. And Guam? It's a U.S. territory, which means its citizens can enlist in the U.S. military. Why would he want to? Hell if I know. We could never ask him. Esau didn't speak a word of English when he showed up, somehow making it through basic training without understanding a single command. They sent him to a local college for ESL classes, but in the meantime, the other Joes took it upon themselves to help him out. His first English phrase? Go eat a dick taco. Classic. Joining the army in a time of war takes guts, but joining one where you don't even speak the same language? That's next level. But Esau didn't do it for citizenship or even a better life. He came here because he loved the game, the military life. After his time in, he went back to Micronesia, no desire to settle in the States. Just did it for the thrill. Then there was the sergeant who got promoted to staff sergeant while we were out at the mortar range. The platoon sergeant asked him to say a few words to inspire the Joes. The guy stood there, cleared his throat, and said, "Well boys, if you stick around long enough, they have to give it to you." That was the speech, and, honestly, he nailed it. I didn't move into the HHC barracks with the rest of the mortars. Not long before I transferred, Buford and I had left our single room, and I ended up with my own space. My roommate, an E4, was usually out of town with his girl, so the place was all mine. And like any good soldier, I kept quiet. If the army closed one door, it opened a window for a little chaos. I found myself in this sweet spot where no one from HHC ever thought to look for me in Dog Company's barracks during room inspections. And when Dog Company came around, I was at work. My room? Just some nameless, faceless place no one bothered with. Every NCO who passed by it just said, "Not my circus, not my monkey." I was living off the grid, flying under the radar, avoiding oversight like a pro. A private pulling off specialist-level sleight of hand. If the brass ever found out, I'm sure Hotel 6 would have given me a meritorious promotion for my sham shield. Meanwhile, I kept seeing Ilana when I wasn't out in the field. One of us would fly to the other for long weekends, every couple of weeks. We spoke every day, and that early, impulsive decision to get married in May 2006 was born out of the kind of infatuation you get at that age, fueled by teenage hormones, and, maybe, a touch of war coming around the corner. I had only 3 years in the army, and I wasn't about to waste them. That same summer, I switched companies. My chain of command knew I was married, but they turned a blind eye to the fact that I was living as a geographical bachelor. That's how I slipped through the cracks in the barracks. I wasn't dumb, more like shrewd. It wasn't a lie of omission, no one ever asked. They told us to be in our rooms for inspection, and I followed orders, sitting there in my room, waiting for the knock that would never come. One memorable weekend, I walked into a small store near our barracks with a battle buddy. He was in front of me, buying beer for both of us, when the cashier, an older woman, asked to see his ID. He went to pull it out, but she waved him off with a grin. "Oh, I'm kidding, honey. If you're old enough to go to war, you're old enough to drink beer." I burned with embarrassment, still only 20 years old, but no one seemed to care. Except maybe if your first sergeant had to work the weekend shift. Still, not having to rely on someone else for beer was huge. This woman, though, was a patriot, and she never once carded me. I ended up being a loyal customer. She was probably a contributor to what Manchu 6 later called a shocking amount of indiscipline leading up to our deployment. Honestly, Dog Company's barracks were party central, but not everyone was wild about it. The kicker? She told me her husband was a retired first sergeant. I guess that's the equivalent of strict parents turning into indulgent grandparents. As we neared deployment, training shifted gears. We started combat lifesaver courses, learning how to handle casualties when there wasn't a medic around. Tourniquets, IVs, treating shock, opening airways with nasal pharyngeals, and needle decompression for collapsed lungs. The real deal. We carried medkits for all these procedures, all designed for the kinds of wounds you expect in combat. Honestly, I hoped I'd never have to use it. But that hope felt like a dream. I started to feel the weight of what was ahead. Every day, I tried to ignore the reality of what war would mean. You could prepare all you wanted, practice those techniques, and build your body up for the physical toll. But it wasn't until I saw the look in the eyes of my battle buddies that I knew we were going to see death. Not just on the training ground, not just in drills. But for real. In the field, we practiced fireman carries and hauling each other around in these skedcos, half-sled, half-stretcher contraptions. And we'd drag each other for miles, breaking our backs, knowing that one of these days, it wouldn't be a drill. Someone would be getting carried out for real. It wasn't just training. We were getting ready for something much worse. We had to learn how to fight through exhaustion, how to shoot straight when your heart rate was maxed out, your muscles screaming, gasping for air. Because when you're out there, facing an enemy who doesn't give a damn about your training or your gear, you've got to keep going, no matter what. You've got to be able to keep your rifle steady, your aim true, even when every inch of your body is begging you to stop. I didn't know it yet, but that kind of pressure was going to be the least of my worries. When the bullets started flying, when the explosions turned the air into fire and the ground into a minefield of chaos, I wasn't going to be worrying about how steady my aim was. I was going to be worrying about my brothers beside me, hoping I could keep them alive long enough for us to get out of it. And when it came down to it, I knew some of us wouldn't make it. That day, whenever it would come, was going to change everything. No more pretending we were invincible. The war had already started, even if we didn't fully understand it yet. And soon, death was going to hit close enough to make us feel it in our bones. Some of us wouldn't be coming home. I just prayed I wouldn't be one of them. We did more than just practice life-saving procedures. We had to survive. And the longer I trained, the more I realized, survival wasn't a guarantee. It was a fight. Every single day. As we kept pushing through our training, a strange sense of inevitability crept into our bones. We knew what was coming, but no one really understood what it would feel like until it was happening to them. The days started to blur into one another. Routine. Every morning, we did our drills. Every afternoon, we practiced how to react when things went to hell. Combat lifesaver drills, rifle ranges, carrying stretchers. It was all rehearsing for a show we knew we'd never be prepared for, no matter how much we practiced. But the physical training couldn't prepare us for the mental side of things. It wasn't just about shooting straight or carrying a wounded man. The real toll came when you knew, in the back of your mind, that this wasn't a game anymore. That the next time you stepped outside the wire, you might not come back. That your friends, the guys you trusted with your life, might not be there when you needed them the most. I started to realize that it wasn't the training that was going to keep us alive, it was the bond we shared. That understanding that, when the bullets started flying, it wouldn't matter how good you were with your rifle or how many drills you'd been through. It would matter how fast you could react, how far you were willing to go for your battle buddies. And in that moment, you wouldn't think about yourself at all. The reality of war started to settle over me like a heavy fog. In the weeks leading up to deployment, we started getting a few stories trickling in from soldiers who had already been out there. Some had just returned from their deployments, others were preparing for their next one. They spoke of things I could hardly wrap my mind around. How you could hear the explosions before you saw them. How the smell of burning flesh mixed with the acrid sting of smoke. How there was no such thing as safe. Not really. The first time I saw a dead body, I wasn't ready for it. I don't think anyone ever is. It was during a training exercise, something that was supposed to be fake, to prepare us for the real thing. But as we ran toward the casualty, I saw it. A soldier, slumped in a pile of dirt, his body covered in blood. The blood wasn't red anymore, it was dark, like a stain that would never come out. He was just lying there, motionless. But in that moment, I could see him, not as a soldier, but as a person. A son, maybe. A brother. A friend. Someone who had family waiting for him back home. Someone who would never make it back. That image stayed with me. I tried to shake it off, but I couldn't. No one could. It was like a warning, a glimpse into the reality that was coming. We were all going to face it sooner or later. The body of a dead soldier would just be the first of many we'd see, hear about, or become. And when the explosions came, they were nothing like we had been prepared for. No drill could simulate the sound of mortar shells whistling overhead, or the sharp crack of small arms fire echoing across the desert. It was as though the world itself was breaking apart. When the bullets hit, you could feel the air shift, a strange sensation of heat that would follow the sound. A split second where the world seemed to freeze, and all you could do was react. I remember the first time we were out on a convoy. The tension was thick, unbearable. We were all hyped up on adrenaline, each of us looking out for the slightest sign of danger. Our convoy of trucks rolled through the streets, heading to the next checkpoint. Nothing seemed out of the ordinary. But that's how it always starts, doesn't it? Calm before the storm. And the storm hit hard. I was in the back of the truck when the first blast went off. My body was thrown forward, slamming into the seat in front of me. It felt like the ground itself had split open. There was a screeching of metal and the sharp snap of gunfire. I remember the sound of the truck's tires screeching as it lost control, careening off the road. I had no idea where we were going, just that it was bad. Everything was bad. My heart was pounding in my chest. I couldn't hear anything anymore, not over the roar of the explosion and the constant crackling of gunfire. The chaos was everywhere. Soldiers were shouting. Some were already on the ground, their bodies twisting in unnatural ways. The smell of dust and diesel fumes filled the air. A few of the guys were already getting their weapons out, ready to return fire, but there was no time to think. No time to do anything except survive. I grabbed my rifle and just moved. Instinct took over. I didn't know it yet, but one of my buddies, Kazinya, was already down. I didn't see him fall, but I felt the hollow emptiness when I realized later that I couldn't find him. He wasn't in the truck anymore. He wasn't anywhere. It wasn't until later that I heard he'd been caught in the blast. That was the first time death hit me personally. It was different when you heard about it in training. It was different when you were told, you'll be in combat soon, but when you watched a man die in front of you, it becomes something you can't ignore. Something that stays with you. I don't know how long the firefight lasted. Time warped in that moment. Everything felt like it was happening in slow motion, yet too fast to understand. When the shooting finally stopped, all I could hear was my breathing, ragged and loud in my ears, and the ringing that wouldn't leave my head. The blast had sent us all into disarray, but the worst part was knowing that we were a target now. That every step we took was a step into more danger. We had to get to cover. We had to find our way out. And even though our instincts screamed for us to stay low, to survive, something else kept pulling me forward, this heavy feeling that we were losing something bigger than just this fight. In the weeks after, we started to realize how many of our own we had lost. A few more had been wounded, some of them critically. Kazinya, the one I had shared laughs with over drinks, wasn't coming back. I knew I'd never forget him. But as much as I wanted to hold on to that memory, the world was moving forward. Every day, we were one step closer to being just another soldier lost in the chaos of war. I used to think I could keep it together. I used to think I could handle the blood, the smoke, the death. But the reality was different when you were in the thick of it. War doesn't just take soldiers, it takes pieces of you, too. A little bit at a time, until you don't recognize yourself anymore. Until you're just trying to hold on to what's left, praying that you can make it out with something to give back when you finally get home. But deep down, I knew. That wasn't going to happen. No one comes back the same from war. Some of us would make it home. Some of us wouldn't. But we would all leave a part of ourselves out there. And that part? It was never coming back. The days following the ambush blurred together. In the aftermath, it was hard to pinpoint any exact moment when the reality of war hit me. It wasn't like a light switch being flipped on, it was more like a creeping fog, thickening with each passing hour, until everything felt distorted and nothing was clear anymore. I remember the silence after the firefight, the absolute stillness that followed the chaos. It's the kind of silence that makes your ears ring and your thoughts race. The sound of blood pounding in your head becomes louder than anything else. Your body is still tense, waiting for the next round, the next explosion, but there's nothing. Just dust and smoke swirling through the air, the remnants of whatever had just happened. I spent those first few minutes just staring. Not at the battlefield, not at the trucks, but at the emptiness. I couldn't process what had happened. The trucks that had once been humming with life now looked like broken toys, the wheels still spinning but the vehicles mangled beyond recognition. I thought of the men inside. Kazinya was the first name that hit me, his face flashed through my mind as I stood there in the wreckage. We had joked together just days before, and now he was gone. That hit harder than I thought it would. I'd known the risks, we all had. But I never thought it would be like this. I never thought it would be one of us. The platoon commander was barking orders. Everyone was scrambling, securing what they could, checking for injuries, trying to get control of the situation. But the reality was, nothing was under control anymore. We were all just trying to keep our heads above water, doing what we had to do to stay alive. I caught a glimpse of Sergeant Harris, his face hard as stone. He wasn't saying much. That was unusual for him. Normally, he was the one cracking jokes, keeping us loose in the hardest moments. But now, his eyes were different. Cold. Far away. Like he was seeing something no one else could. I could see it in the way his hands shook as he checked his weapon. Even though we were trained to expect the worst, this felt like something new. This felt like the kind of experience that carved out a piece of you and never gave it back. By the time we were back at base, I was numb. I didn't feel like I was in my own body anymore. The adrenaline rush that had kept us going through the chaos was gone, and in its place was a kind of quiet despair. I didn't want to talk to anyone. I didn't want to explain what I'd seen, what I'd felt, because I didn't understand it myself. But it wasn't the physical toll that would take the longest to recover from. That was just the obvious stuff, the cuts, the bruises, the sore muscles from hauling a litter or dragging gear across the desert. No, the real scars were the ones you couldn't see. The ones that dug into your soul when you watched a friend die, when you felt the weight of their absence like a stone in your chest. It wasn't just Kazinya I lost that day. It was a part of me. A part of all of us. Every soldier out there that day was walking around with their own piece of the puzzle missing, even if no one else could see it. The days went on. We went through the motions. More patrols. More training. More death. The whole cycle continued, and we all tried to adapt. I had my moments, though. Moments when it felt like I wasn't even in control of my own thoughts anymore. I'd catch myself staring off into space, not hearing the shouts from the NCOs, not seeing the rest of the guys around me. I'd find myself drifting back to that day, back to the sound of the explosions, back to the moment I'd realized I'd never be the same again. It was hard to focus on anything. It was hard to even remember what home felt like. When I tried, it was like a dream fading, slipping through my fingers the more I reached for it. I missed Ilana, of course, but even the thought of her felt distant now, like it belonged to another version of me. The version of me who hadn't seen the things I'd seen. The version of me who hadn't been scarred by the brutal reality of war. But there were fleeting moments when I'd remember what it was like to feel alive, to remember the sound of her laugh, the way she'd look at me when I said something stupid. I clung to those memories, even as they slipped further away. The hardest part was knowing that the longer I stayed out here, the more those memories would begin to fade into the distance. As we got closer to the end of our deployment, the sense of dread became heavier. It wasn't just the fear of death. It was the fear of what would happen to us after it was all over. The war was going to end someday, but the scars, the trauma, it wasn't going to end. Not for any of us. I saw it happening to the guys around me. Some of them were starting to crack under the pressure. You could see it in their eyes, in the way their hands trembled when they picked up their weapons, in the way they jumped at every little noise. I knew what was coming. PTSD wasn't just a word we learned in training, it was a real thing, and it was already taking root in the men around me. But we couldn't talk about it. Not openly, not the way we needed to. We were soldiers. We were tough. We didn't have time for that. But in the quiet moments, when we sat around the barracks or in the field, you could feel the weight of it. Everyone was carrying something. Some of us were carrying the weight of the men we had lost. Some of us were carrying the weight of the things we'd done or seen. And the worst part was that no one ever spoke about it. Not out loud. Not in a way that could help us heal. One night, after a particularly rough day, I found myself alone in the barracks. The others were out doing whatever, but I just needed a moment to breathe. I grabbed a bottle of cheap whiskey that I'd been saving for days. It burned as it went down, but for a second, it was the only thing that made me feel like I was still human, still alive. I let the alcohol do its job. The numbness settled in. I closed my eyes, and for a moment, I wasn't in Iraq. I wasn't holding a weapon or worrying about the next ambush. I was just a guy, sitting in a dimly lit room, trying to hold on to something that wasn't slipping away. But even in that moment of temporary escape, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't the same anymore. None of us were. We had been changed in ways we couldn't even understand yet. We had seen too much, felt too much. We had walked through hell, and now we had to figure out how to live with it. When I woke up the next morning, the world felt just a little bit heavier. But I wasn't alone in it. None of us were. We had to keep going, no matter how much it hurt, no matter how much it changed us. We were in it together. And that, in the end, was the one thing that kept me going. The bond we shared as soldiers, as brothers, was the only thing that could get us through. Because even though we were all scarred in our own ways, we were still here. And that counted for something.